Hello again, this is Dr. Dillard, and I wanted to make a supplemental video to the previous video I made dealing with Wittgenstein's earlier and later philosophy, different aspects in his earlier and later thinking. And what I want to do in this supplemental video is say a little bit more about Wittgenstein's later approach. I thought that some of the things I said there were a bit too sketchy and vague, and so I wanted to try to clarify that a bit. And so recall that one of the ways I described Wittgenstein's earlier philosophical approach is that even though our ordinary language as we use it in everyday contexts is perfectly okay, is perfectly in order as it stands, we get into philosophical confusions when we fail to go vertical, when we fail to go deep and grasp the underlying logical structure of the ordinary sentences or propositions of our language. Now, in Wittgenstein's later philosophy, again, as I remarked in my previous video, Wittgenstein believes that our ordinary everyday practices involving language are perfectly in order as they stand, but we can get into confusions about things philosophical confusions, when we conflate or run together different language games, or come up with another way he puts this sometimes is saying, and maybe this will be more germane to what I want to discuss this afternoon, we come up with misleading philosophical pictures that may be onto something important about our practices, but they are misdepicting it, they are distorting it. And so we need to get clear, we need to unravel these pictures or diffuse them, so to speak, so that they no longer no longer engender philosophical confusion, and we can appreciate aright what they do track and sort of present this in a non-confusing way. So what I want to do is bring all of this down to earth by looking at a discussion between two other ordinary language philosophers in the Oxford tradition, Gilbert Ryle and Ryle-Urmson. And there's a certain issue that comes up in their discussion, and I want to show how Wittgenstein's approach helps to clarify this issue that comes up. So this is a discussion that was televised back in the 70s, I think it was, as part of an episode called Logic Lane, and I will provide a link to the YouTube video with this, where you can see this conversation, this particular episode of that series, in the feed under this YouTube video. But one of the things that Ryle and Urmson discuss or are sort of batting around in this conversation has to do with the concepts of being clever, being vain, and intending. And so they both agree that I am in a better position than you are, say, to judge your cleverness. And you are often, more often than not, if not always, in a better position than I am to judge my vanity than I am. You're in a better position to judge my vanity than I am. And Urmson goes on to make an interesting comment to the effect that I'm in a better position to tell you what I intend than you are. So I'm in a better position than you are to tell you what my intentions are, what I'm intending to do, and so forth. Now, very quickly we can get into a philosophical confusion here. There's a certain traditional picture that almost immediately begins to assert itself. And there are two aspects to this picture, according to which when I intend something, when I have an intention or engage in an act of intending, what's really going on is some interior mental process in my mind that only I have direct access to and that other people do not. Unless I tell them about it, they're not going to know it. So the traditional picture offers an explanation of why I'm in a better position than other people to report my intentions, because it's a private inner mental act of mine to which I have both privileged access, that's one point, and also a certain kind of privacy that nobody else can really have access to it. It's not just that I have access to it better than other people, but really nobody else can have access to it directly unless I tell them about it. And very quickly we can get into problems about, well, how do I know that other people have intentions, and how do I know that they have minds? How do they really know that I do? How can they trust what I say? And a whole ravel of philosophical problems begins to look pretty foreboding and problematic. So what I want to do is now turn to Wittgenstein, something that he says in the Philosophical Investigations, and then apply it to an example, work through it to show how this sheds light on this issue about intending, that Urmson raises, and then I want to come back at the end of the video presentation to the remarks about vanity and the remarks about cleverness. So this is something that Wittgenstein says in Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 638 in Philosophical Investigations, which is probably his most famous and influential later work. So he says something like this. He says this exactly. If for a moment I intended to pretend to someone that I was unwell, that required an antecedent context. If someone says, quote, for a moment, ... unquote, is he really only describing a momentary process? But not even the entire background was evidence for my saying for a moment. And so what's important about this remark what I want to pick up on is this notion that we need to have an antecedent context. In other words, the notion of intending is inextricably interwoven with an antecedent context. And so let's go back to examples of intending, and I want to read for some research that I'm doing on this question right now in the course of a book that I'm writing. And let's look at what is the relationship between intending and an antecedent context. So suppose that somebody's waiting under the railroad station roof at the train station, and we say, well, he intends or she intends to catch the next train. So how do we learn? One of the things that Wittgenstein would ask us to look at, instead of going deep, now going horizontally, is, well, how do we learn the meaning of terms like intends? And it might be something like this, like if a teacher were instructing a young child or maybe someone who's a non-English speaker in the use of that English expression, the teacher might say something like this. Someone who intends to catch the next train first learns when it's going to arrive, then goes to the station before that time, waits until it arrives, and gets on it after the train has stopped and the doors have opened. So part of intending, so when we say that and we're teaching somebody the meaning of that term as it's ordinarily used in everyday language, there's a reference to an antecedent context where the person has learned when the next train is going to arrive. And that could happen in a number of different ways. Perhaps the person, is a morning commuter and she's in her apartment all by herself and she checks the train station, or she goes online or something like that, and she sees when the next train is going to arrive, and so she then behaves or acts accordingly. She shows up at the train station shortly before that time and then proceeds to board the train. That kind of situation is the kind of situation we would describe if we wanted to teach our pupil what that expression in English means. Or maybe she learned it from a friend. Maybe a friend told her that the train was going to arrive around exactly at 9 a.m., and so she makes sure that she gets there by that time in order to catch the train. But notice that the antecedent context here in which she learns when the train is going to arrive, it could involve what we would think in ordinary terms is a private situation. She's in the privacy of her home. Now, certainly, the privacy here is not essential to her. The privacy is not something that's absolutely necessary, because we could imagine a passerby peeking in the window of her apartment and noticing her checking the train station online or from a schedule in her hand. So it's not essentially private. It's not something that is in principle beyond the purview of other individuals, but it is something that she typically, if it is a private situation, if she's in the privacy of her own home, since nobody else typically is there, she's in a better position than anybody else to report that, well, I intended to go to the train and because earlier I checked the schedule and I saw that it was going to arrive at such and such a time, and so I made sure I was there. So that interior or antecedent context, as Wittgenstein calls it, is absolutely crucial in many cases to her intending something, and she, more often than not, is in a better position to report the necessary antecedent condition, how she learned that the train was going to arrive, than anybody else, even though it's not essentially or in principle private to her. Furthermore, there are cases when somebody might intend to do something and have the intention to deceive. Wittgenstein himself mentioned, if for a moment I intended to pretend to someone that I was unwell, that required an antecedent context. Now let me give you another example of how someone teaching a pupil the meaning of the word intention and its cognates in English, a kind of pedagogical situation to which the teacher might refer. So let's take the very famous case of the boy who cried wolf. So the teacher might say, a boy who steals a lamb when no one else is around and then cries wolf intends to deceive those who come running into thinking that the lamb was just taken by a wolf. So here the boy in the famous story stole a wolf, and then he wants to deceive other people into thinking that the wolf was taken by a lamb, and so this is his intention. Well, notice that in this case, the antecedent context that is crucial and it is absolutely essential to his having that intention is that he stole the roof. And here's an important point there. Notice that he can't tell other people about stealing the wolf and then succeed in having the intention to deceive them, because his intending them to deceive them essentially requires that he not reveal what really happened. Okay, that's not simply an accidental feature of his intention. It's necessary because for his intention to be an intention, it has to have some chance of succeeding. And the only way it has a chance of succeeding is if he deceives other people. That is, he's party or privy to this prior or antecedent situation, as Wittgenstein calls it, and moreover, he can't reveal it to other people. There's a sense in which it is essentially private. But notice that it's not essentially private in some rarefied philosophical sense. It's essentially private in that, well, he can't reveal this, the boy can't reveal this, and then have an intention to deceive, because the intention to deceive piggybacks off the fact that he has done something that he conceals from other people. So what I want to say here in a Wittgensteinian vein, a later Wittgensteinian vein, after we've gone horizontal now and looked at pedagogical situations and antecedent contexts to try to understand how a particular expression in our language functions, what I want to say here is that the philosopher who talks about intending as being something to which the intender has privileged access, and that is even private in an important sense, there's a level on which that is correct. The philosopher, the traditional philosopher, is tracking something important about our concept of intention. And what's important about the concept of intention becomes clear when we go through the kind of analysis that I just went through using the examples that I just did. But the kind of privileged access that the person has to the antecedent context, or even the way that antecedent context in certain cases must be private, not shared by that person with other people, not shareable by that person with others, the sense in which that's true has nothing to do with this picture, this philosophical picture of someone who has an intention sort of introspecting some private interior mental state to which she not only has privileged access, but which is in some sense, which is private, essentially, or in principle private, because nobody else can know about it except her. She's the only one who can know about it, which gets us into the problem of other minds very quickly. So even though the philosophical picture is tracking something important about our concept of intention, it doesn't become clear what it's tracking and how it's misleading. It's doing so in a misleading and a potentially confusing way, and we unravel this confusion, we diffuse the misleadingness by undertaking this kind of analysis of how we use expressions in everyday life in ordinary language. So that's I think that's a helpful example, I hope that it is, of Wittgenstein's later technique. Now, what about the other two questions issues that Urmson and Ryle bring up in their discussion? Well, remember that one of them is that typically I am in a better position than you are to assess your cleverness, and similarly the other way around. You're in a better position than I am to assess my cleverness. Now, why is that? And there might be different explanations of it, but let's just imagine again an ordinary situation in which we would say that somebody is clever. Suppose that we're out bird watching with a bunch of with a class, and the teacher is about to point to a bird up in the tree and say, well, what is, and before the teacher can even complete her sentence or his sentence, the student says, American goldfinch, without even, so the teacher doesn't even get to the end of the question before the student knows the answer. So we would say, well, the student was quite clever there, because this is reflected in the extremely concise syntax or the brevity of the answer and the rapidity with which the student gives the answer, and the teacher and other people observing the student are in a better position to assess that than the student. She's caught up, the student is caught up simply in giving the right answer. She's not thinking about how she's talking. In fact, she better not be thinking about how she's talking, because that's part of what enables her to respond so quickly. But we who are observing her, the teacher and her co-pupils and so forth, the co-students, fellow students, they can see that the answer that she gave was extremely concise and rapid, and they are in a better position then to judge these syntactic markers, if you will, of cleverness than she is. Now, what about the other concept, vanity? Ryle and Urmson say that, well, you're in a better position than I am to judge whether or not I'm vain, to assess my vanity, and I'm in a better position than you are to assess your vanity. Why is that? Well, let's take a variation on the bird watching example. And suppose that somebody goes out, this time with another group, and it's the same scenario. The teacher points to the bird in the treetop and asks, well, what is that? And somebody answers in the following way. As a descendant of a long and highly esteemed line of expert bird watchers who has keen eyesight, is blessed with perfect hearing, and who, to boot, has studied extensively with the illustrious French ornithologist Madame Z at the Sorbonne, I believe that the bird twittering away over there in the bush is, as a matter of fact, a member of the species Spinus tristis, commonly known as the American goldfinch. So here's this verbose, wordy answer that the person gives, and it contains the correct information, right? This person gets it right. But notice that the person's report calls more attention or draws more attention to himself than it does to the fact that's being reported, and that he gets all caught up into he's dropping names, he engages in name dropping, he talks about being at the Sorbonne and blah, blah, blah. He goes on and on about it. So really his report is more about showing how clever he is, or showing how he came to know what he did, than his reporting what he knows or what he sees. And so we who observe this, rather than he who's caught up in the middle of being, verbose, we're in a better position to judge this kind of verbosity on his part, which is a part of our, a very good indicator of someone's being vain than he is. So once again, in answering both of those other questions that Urmson and Ryle discuss, it helps to go horizontal. It helps to look at and to call to mind various situations that might or do occur in real life where we use the relative terms, where we express the relative concepts, to see how they actually function. And the hope is, for Wittgenstein in his later philosophy, the hope is that when we do that, we can come to appreciate what it is about philosophical ideas in many cases that may be tracking something important about our everyday concepts, but in a misleading and a potentially confusing way that can get us very quickly bogged down in philosophical paradoxes if we are not careful to put these situations in the proper context, to see them and appreciate them in the proper context of our everyday ordinary language and our lives, against the backdrop of which we use these various expressions. So that's all I wanted to say right now. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the feed under this video. I hope that helps. I hope that gives you a little bit better sense of really what is quite fascinating and interesting about Wittgenstein's later philosophical approach. So until next time, this is Dr. Dillard, and again, I wish you luck in your studies of Wittgenstein and related philosophical issues. Until next time, this is Dr. Dillard. Have a good day.